The woman from the Kentucky Attorney General's office had a habit of going still when something surprised her. Not frozen still, the way water goes still before it reflects something clearly. Diane Corbin had developed this quality over 6 years of investigating fraud, consumer deception, financial crimes that left ordinary people with less than they started with, and she had learned that the stillness was useful, that it let her absorb what she was seeing without the interference of premature reaction. She was very still now. The ledger on her desk was green-covered, the standard accountant's variety available at any office supply store, the kind that had been manufactured to the same specifications for 80 years, because there was nothing wrong with the original design. This one was filled from the first page to the last in handwriting that belonged to a person who had decided long ago that if a thing was worth recording, it was worth recording so that someone else could read it. Precise. Even. The columns were ruled in pencil before the ink went in. Every entry dated. Every number cross-referenced to a notation in the margin. She turned pages, she kept turning. In the chair across her desk sat a man who had driven 4 hours from Bell County that morning, departing before the sun had cleared the ridgeline in a truck he had maintained himself, and that ran by all available evidence without complaint. He was 71 years old. He wore a flannel shirt that had been washed and pressed. He had no attorney with him, no advocate, no representative of any kind. He had the ledger, which was now on her desk, and he had the patience of someone for whom patience was not a virtue so much as a baseline condition of existence. Diane reached the summary section at the back. The cross-referenced deed records, the appraised values set against hammer prices, the resale figures pulled from county property records and entered in the same careful columns as everything else. She looked at the calculations. She looked at the man. Mr. Dees, her voice came out quieter than she intended. How long did it take you to put this together? Harlow Dees considered the question the way he considered most questions, without rushing, as though the answer deserved the same attention he had given everything else in the ledger. 14 months, he said. Give or take. She looked at the ledger again, at the 9 auction records, at the 3 recurring bidder numbers, at the margin notation that read in the same unhurried hand as everything else, brother-in-law confirmed via deed record, cross-reference lot 14 November transaction. And you did this on your own, she said. I had the time, Harlow said. She closed the ledger the way you close something that has just altered the character of your afternoon, and she stood and she said she needed to get her supervisor, and she meant it. Pull it back now. Pull it back 14 months to a Tuesday in July that smelled of cut grass and warm cattle and the particular dry electricity that gathers above a crowd assembled outdoors under a sky that has been bright since before most of them woke up. Pull it back to Harlan County, Kentucky, to a hillside farm on the kind of ground that builds a man's legs over decades, because the terrain simply doesn't accommodate flatness, and to a morning that was already in the high 80s by 10 o'clock and climbing. The Caldwell farm had been a working operation since 1969, when Earl Caldwell had purchased the land at 32 years old, with money saved over 7 years of labor that had left permanent marks on his hands and a permanent understanding in his body of what it meant to want something badly enough to work for it, without certainty of outcome. 160 acres of it. Steep pasture on the upper slopes where a man got his exercise whether he wanted it or not, and creek bottom fields below where the soil ran dark and productive, and didn't require much argument to grow good grass. A farmhouse that had been added to twice over the decades, each addition done carefully and in keeping with what was already there. A bank barn that was genuinely solid, the kind of construction that reflected the character of the person who ordered it built. A creek running through the lower property that Earl had fished for 60 years and that still held bass in the deep bends where old sycamore roots reached into the water like the fingers of something that had been there longer than any of the human activity on the surrounding land. Earl Caldwell had died in May at 82. He had farmed until he was 80 years old, which is a fact that sounds simple, but contains within it an entire way of being in the world, a refusal to separate the self from the work, a conviction that the land required presence and not administration. The 2 years of declining health that followed had reduced him to watching from the porch what he could no longer accomplish in the field. For a man like Earl, that watching had its own particular weight. He left the farm to his granddaughter, Nora. Nora Caldwell was 34 years old, a graphic designer working out of Lexington, and she had loved her grandfather with the uncomplicated totality that is available to grandchildren who were never required to negotiate the complicated dynamics of being his child. She had spent summers on the farm as a girl. She knew the creek. She knew the sound the barn made in wind. She had loved Earl Caldwell completely, and she had loved the farm genuinely, and neither of those facts made the question of what to do with 160 acres of hill country in Harlan County any simpler to answer. She spent 2 months after Earl's death working through the possibilities with the honesty of a person who knows the difference between what she wants to be true and what is actually true. She considered renting the land to a neighboring operation. She looked at the numbers and the logistics and the distance. She considered holding it as a long-term investment. She considered briefly and with real seriousness whether there was a version of her life in which she managed the property herself from Lexington, drove down on weekends, learned what she didn't know. She gave that version its full consideration before she set it aside. The honest assessment was this: the farm would be better served by someone who could work it fully than by her well-intentioned remote management. The land deserved more than an heir who loved it without being able to tend it. She decided to sell. Colt Graver came to the farm in June representing Pinnacle Rural Auction Group. He was in his mid-50s, trim, well-organized, in the manner of a man who has built his self-presentation into something that functions like a credential. He spoke with the practiced fluency of someone who has spent a career explaining unfamiliar processes to people who are not in a position to evaluate the explanation, which is to say, he spoke with a fluency designed to produce comfort rather than understanding. He told Nora that the farm would receive full market exposure, that Pinnacle's registered bidder database covered 4 states and included every serious agricultural land buyer in the region, that the competitive auction process was the most reliable mechanism available for achieving maximum value in an estate sale context, that she was in good hands. Nora believed him. She had no particular reason not to. She signed the contract with Pinnacle Rural Auction Group in the 3rd week of June, and she began making the arrangements that needed to be made, and she trusted the process the way a person trusts a process when they have no way of knowing what she didn't yet know. Harlow Dees had been attending farm auctions in eastern Kentucky since he was 16 years old, when his father had taken him to an equipment sale in Bell County on a Saturday in September, and Harlow had spent the entire proceeding watching the mechanics of it. Not the lots, not the prices, but the system itself, how it moved, how the crowd functioned as a collective organism, how the auctioneer managed rhythm and attention, how genuine competition between bidders had a particular quality of energy that was different from everything else happening in that field. He had been watching systems his entire life. 50 years of mechanical work had given him a relationship with the way things operated that was somewhere between skill and instinct. The capacity to register anomaly before analysis caught up with sensation, to hear a wrong note in an engine's rhythm. The way a musician hears a wrong note in music at a level below conscious processing. He had diagnosed failing components by sound alone, by the particular quality of a vibration, by a smell that was fractionally wrong, by a rhythm of operation that was 1 degree off from what it should be. He retired at 68 after half a century of that work, and found, as men of his temperament often find, that retirement was not the condition he had been told it would be. He did not want to fish every day. He was not interested in moving somewhere warmer. He had lived within 12 miles of where he was born for his entire life, and he had no desire to change that. What he did in the absence of the work that had structured his days for 5 decades was continue to attend farm auctions. He had been going to them for years already. Not to buy, he rarely bought anything at auctions anymore, but for the same reasons that men of his generation went to diners or hardware stores. Community, familiarity, the pleasure of being among people who spoke the same language, which in this case was the language of agricultural commerce, of what land was worth and who was moving it and what the patterns were. He knew the patterns. That was the accurate description of what 50 years of mechanical attention had left him with. He knew what things looked like when they were running correctly. On the 2nd Tuesday of July, Harlow drove to the Caldwell farm auction. He had known Earl Caldwell the way you know people when you have lived within 12 miles of them for 50 years without ever becoming close friends, which in eastern Kentucky means you know the important things. You know whether a man's word is good. You know whether his land is well kept. You know his reputation in the particular way that rural communities develop reputations not through gossip, but through accumulated observation. Earl Caldwell's reputation was that he was a straight dealer and a serious farmer, and that his land was good ground. Harlow came to the auction to see what good ground would bring. He arrived early enough to find a position at the back of the crowd. This was habitual. He always stood at the back where he could see the full field of bidders rather than the auctioneer's face. He had learned long ago that what happened in a crowd at an auction was often more interesting than what happened on the stand. The crowd that Tuesday was perhaps 40 people, a mix of neighboring farmers, land investors, the casually curious, a few faces Harlow recognized from other auctions, a few he didn't. Colt Graver worked the portable stand near the barn with a microphone system and a registered bidder number program, and the fast rhythmic call of an auctioneer who knew how to maintain momentum through a lot sequence. The personal property lots went first. Equipment, tools, household items accumulated over 60-some years of a working life. Harlow watched them move through without particular attention. He was watching the crowd, 3 men. He noticed them in the first 20 minutes not because they did anything wrong, but because of what they didn't do. They were positioned in different parts of the crowd, one near the equipment, one toward the left edge of the gathering, one standing slightly back from the main body of bidders, and they held their numbered paddles without raising them. This was not unusual in itself. Plenty of people at any auction attend without bidding or without bidding early. What registered with Harlow at the level below analysis was something more subtle: the quality of their attention. They were watching the proceedings the way people watch something they are managing rather than something they are experiencing. There is a difference, and it is visible if you know what to look for. A person experiencing an auction has a certain kind of engagement. They track the item being sold, they respond to prices, their body language shifts with the momentum of competition. A person managing an auction has a different quality of stillness. They are processing rather than reacting. They are waiting for a specific cue. These 3 men were waiting. The real property lot was called in the early afternoon. 160 acres, the Caldwell homestead. Opening bid requested at $50,000. One of the 3 men raised his paddle. Colt Graver acknowledged it smoothly and called for 55. The crowd was quiet. Harlow watched. A woman he didn't recognize standing near the center of the group wearing a blue jacket, despite the heat, the kind of determination in her posture that belongs to someone who came with a number in mind, offered 52,000. The first man went to 54. The woman considered went to 56. The second of the 3 men, not the first, raised his paddle at 58. The woman paused. She went to 60. Then the third man entered at 62. The woman stopped. The bidding continued among the 3 men. 64, 66, 68, 70, moving in increments that looked from a distance like genuine competition. But Harlow was not watching from a distance. He was watching the way he had watched engines for 50 years, and what he saw was not competition. The hesitations were too consistent. The increments never varied. No one pushed. No one showed the involuntary physical signals of genuine desire, the slight lean forward, the unconscious calculation visible in the face of a person deciding in real time whether they can afford to go higher. These men were performing the form of competition without its substance. The hammer came down at $187,000. Bidder number 14, one of the 3 men. Harlow stood at the back of the crowd with his auction program and looked at the number. He had looked up the county appraisal record before coming. He always looked up appraised values before attending auctions because a hammer price only means something in relation to what the property is worth. The Caldwell farm had been appraised at $271,000. $187,000 was 31% below that figure. For a farm with no observable defects, no environmental problems he was aware of, no deferred maintenance that would account for a discount of that magnitude. The creek land was productive. The barn was sound. The house was in reasonable repair. The hill pasture was steep but functional. 31% below appraised value was not a market result. Harlow drove home. He took the same roads he always took through the county seat and out the highway and up the hollow to the property where he had lived for 37 years, and he did not turn on the radio. He thought about what he had seen with the particular focused quality of thought that serious mechanical problems had always produced in him, not anxious, not agitated, but concentrated, organized, working through what the evidence indicated and what it didn't yet indicate. He pulled into the drive. He went past the house to the workshop. The workshop was where Harlow had spent the majority of his working life, Not this specific workshop, which had been built to his specifications when he purchased the property, but workshops of this general character with the smell of oil and metal and the particular quality of lamplight in a space designed for close work. He still kept tools here. He still did small jobs for neighbors, not because he needed the money, but because the work was satisfying and because the alternative was not working, which did not suit him. He sat down at the workbench. He opened the drawer where he kept his record supplies. He took out a new ledger, green, covered the standard accountant's variety, the same kind he had used for parts orders and repair logs for 5 decades, and he set it on the bench in front of him. He wrote the date at the top of the first page. He wrote the auction location. He wrote Pinnacle Rural Auction Group, and beneath that, Colt Graver. He wrote the 3 bidder numbers he had noted during the proceedings. He wrote the hammer price. He wrote the appraised value. He wrote the percentage difference, 31% below appraisal. He closed the ledger. He sat in the workshop for a while under the lamp with the smell of oil around him and the summer dark coming on outside the windows. He was not certain yet. He was almost certain, which was a different thing, and he had spent 50 years learning the difference. An almost certain diagnosis of a mechanical problem sent you looking for more evidence, not to the parts store. An almost certain diagnosis of anything sent you looking for more evidence. He went to the kitchen. He made supper, eggs and toast, because it was late and he wasn't particularly hungry. He watched the evening news. He went to bed at his normal hour. Before he turned off the light, he had already decided what he was going to do next. The following morning, Harlow drove to the public library in Harlan. He had not come here looking for legal research that would come later. He came because the library had a computer terminal with a reliable internet connection, and because his granddaughter had shown him 2 years earlier how to use the county deed records database and the property appraisal portal maintained by the Harlan County Assessor's Office. He had used these tools before in a general way when he wanted to understand what land in a particular area was selling for. He had never used them the way he was about to use them. He looked up the Caldwell farm deed transfer first. There it was, 160 acres transferred on the date of the auction. Hammer price recorded as consideration bidder number 14, corresponding to a name in the Pinnacle registered bidder system, which was posted publicly as Kentucky auction law required. The name was Darren Speck. He wrote the name in the ledger. Then he looked up the schedule of upcoming Pinnacle Rural Auction Group events. Kentucky's auction board maintained a public listing of licensed auctioneers and their scheduled sales. Pinnacle had 11 real property auctions on the calendar over the following 12 months, spread across 4 eastern Kentucky counties. Harlow sat at the library computer and looked at those 11 dates. He was 71 years old. He had no particular obligations on any of those dates. He had considerable patience, which was not something he had ever thought of as a skill until he encountered people who didn't have it. He had the green ledger in his jacket pocket. He copied the 11 auction dates, locations, and property descriptions into the ledger. He drove home. He sat in the workshop and looked at what he had. One data point was not a pattern. One auction with a hammer price 31% below appraisal was not by itself evidence of anything except possibly a bad day, an undermarketed sale, a thin crowd. He had seen thin crowds at farm auctions produce legitimate low prices. He had seen motivated sellers accept outcomes that didn't reflect full value because they needed the liquidity. There were legitimate explanations for a single anomalous result. What would make it more than a single anomaly was repetition. If the same structural signature appeared at multiple Pinnacle auctions, the same cluster of bidders, the same rhythm of false competition, the same suppressed outcomes, then the probability of legitimate explanation collapsed. The probability of something else rose to a level that required action. He decided to attend 9 of the 11 scheduled events. He chose 9 because the remaining 2 were scheduled on dates when he had prior commitments. He considered genuinely important a medical appointment he had already rescheduled once a family occasion he would not miss. 9 out of 11 was sufficient. If the pattern was there, 9 auctions would show it. If it wasn't there, 9 auctions would show that too. 3 weeks after the Caldwell auction, Harlow drove 40 minutes to a property sale in Leslie County, 112 acres of mixed ground timber and pasture belonging to the estate of a man named Cecil Pruitt, who had died in the spring. Harlow arrived 45 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. He positioned himself at the back of the crowd as it assembled with a view of the full field of registered bidders. He photographed the posted bidder list with his phone, His granddaughter had shown him how to do this a year ago for reasons unrelated to the current project, and he had found the capability unexpectedly useful. He noted the bidder numbers in his ledger before the auction started. Two of the three numbers he had written down from the Caldwell auction appeared on the Leslie County registered bidder list. Harlow absorbed this information without visible reaction. He watched the early lot's personal property equipment tools. The two familiar numbers remained inactive. The crowd moved through the morning with the normal rhythms of a working auction competitive, where the lots were desirable thin, where they weren't. When the real property lot was called, the pattern assembled itself with a precision that Harlow found almost mechanical in its consistency. A third bidder entered the competition early, a number he hadn't seen at Caldwell, but that appeared now with the same quality of managed participation he had identified 3 weeks earlier. The three bidders, two from Caldwell, one new, traded the farm back and forth in regular increments, while the handful of outside bidders who entered the competition fell away at prices well below what the ground was worth. The hammer came down. Harlow wrote the number in his ledger. He wrote the bidder who won. He wrote the hammer price. He had looked up the county appraisal before coming. The farm had been assessed at $164,000. It sold for $109,000, 34% below appraisal. He drove home. He added the Leslie County deed record data to the ledger when it became available online 3 days later. He waited for the next auction on the Pinnacle schedule, which was 6 weeks away in Perry County. This was how the 14 months began, not with a confrontation, not with a declaration, not with anything that would make sense as a story's beginning from the outside. It began with a man driving home from an auction in the summer heat, opening a green ledger, writing down what he had seen, and deciding to look at the next one. It began with the second Tuesday. The work developed its own rhythm over the following months. Harlow would learn an upcoming auction date prepare by pulling the county appraisal records and any available history on the property drive to the sale position himself at the back of the crowd. Photograph the bidder list, record the auction in real time. Every bid, every bidder number, every increment, the hesitation patterns, the body language he observed. He drove home. He pulled the deed transfer records as they became available. He recorded the hammer price against the appraisal. He waited to see whether the property sold again. He was building a comparison table. That was the most accurate description of what he was doing, the same process he had always used when diagnosing a problem that didn't have an obvious single cause. The process of assembling enough data points that the pattern became undeniable, that the diagnosis stopped being a hypothesis and became a conclusion. The pattern assembled itself across auction after auction with a consistency that Harlow found simultaneously clarifying and deeply uncomfortable. Clarifying because it removed any remaining possibility that he was looking at coincidence. Uncomfortable because of what the clarity meant for the people whose land was selling at those suppressed prices. He attended the Perry County auction in September. Two of the three familiar bidder numbers appeared. The hammer price on a 90-acre bottomland farm came in 28% below the county appraisal. He attended the Clay County auction in October, where all three familiar numbers appeared, along with a fourth he hadn't seen before. The hammer price on a combined timber and pasture tract came in 33% below appraisal. He attended two auctions in November, one in Harlan County and one in Knox County. The Harlan County auction showed the pattern clearly. The Knox County auction was different. The Knox County auction had no cluster. He watched the entire proceeding from his position at the back of the crowd, and the familiar bidder numbers were not there. Not one of them. The bidding on the Knox County real property lot, 140 acres of river bottom farmland that had been in the same family since the Eisenhower administration, was genuine. He could feel it the way he felt a correctly tuned engine, the particular quality of energy that belongs to authentic competition, the back and forth of people who actually want the same thing. The hammer price came in at $231,000 against a county appraisal of $228,000. Above appraisal, fair market result by any measure. Harlow sat with this on the drive home from Knox County and understood what it meant with the satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed. The land market in eastern Kentucky was not soft. The suppressed prices at the Pinnacle auctions where the cluster appeared were not the result of economic conditions or low demand. The cluster was the cause, and its absence produced a normal result, and its presence produced a result that was not normal by any measure of the word. He wrote in the ledger, Knox County, no cluster hammer at $231,000 against appraisal, $228,000. Market price achieved. Pattern is not market conditions. Pattern is manufactured. He underlined the last sentence. It was the only underlining in the ledger. The physical deed records were the next piece. Harlow had been pulling deed transfers online where the county records were digitized, but not all of the Eastern Kentucky County deed records were fully available in digital form, and he needed the complete picture. In January of the second year, he drove to the Harlan County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning and introduced himself to the clerk at the records desk. Her name was Berta Sloan. She had worked in the county clerk's office for long enough that she had processed deed transfers for 3 generations of the same family names, and she regarded the public records as genuinely and completely public in a way that not every county clerk does. When Harlow explained that he was researching property transaction histories for personal interest, she showed him where the record books were kept and left him to work without further inquiry because that was her job. He spent 4 Tuesday mornings at the courthouse over the following 3 months working through the deed records for every property he had watched sell at the pattern auctions. What he found in those records confirmed the final piece of the picture he had been assembling. Every property that had sold at a suppressed hammer price at the auctions where the cluster was present had been resold. Everyone. Within 12 to 18 months of the auction sale, each of those properties appeared again in the deed transfer records conveyed by the entity that had purchased them at the auction to a different buyer for a price between 22 and 38% higher than what had been paid at the auction. The ring was not buying farms to hold. It was buying them at artificially suppressed prices and selling them promptly at market value, capturing the difference. Harlow recorded every resale transaction in the ledger. He cross-referenced the purchasing entities at the pattern auctions against the selling entities in the resale records. The purchasing entities were different names, different bidder registrations, different business entities on the deed transfers, but a cross-reference of the registered agents listed in the Kentucky Secretary of State's business filings, which were also public record, showed connections between them. He worked through this cross-referencing slowly and carefully over the courthouse visits and additional research sessions at the library. When the connection emerged, it was not subtle. One of the bidder numbers appearing consistently across the pattern auctions, a registration under a business entity called Redstone Land Holdings, was connected through its registered agent to a man named Darren Speck. Speck's name also appeared in the Harlan County property records as a grantor in 2 of the resale transactions. A business search for Darren Speck revealed a second business registration, this one with Pinnacle Rural Auction Group listed as the management contact. Darren Speck was Colt Graver's brother-in-law. Harlow wrote this in the ledger. He wrote it in the same careful, even hand he had used for every other entry because this was not the moment for emphasis. The emphasis was in the fact itself, and the fact didn't need decoration. He closed the ledger. He thanked Berta Sloan on his way out. He drove home through the January cold, the fields bare on either side of the road, the hill farms of Harlan County lying quiet under a sky the color of old concrete. By the time he reached his drive, he knew the outline of what he had. He didn't know yet whether it was enough. That was the next question, and it required a different kind of research, not property records and bidder lists, but the language of the law itself, which was not a language he had ever needed to learn. He was not a man who acted on almost. The following week, he drove to the public library in Harlan and asked for help. The library work came in the weeks that followed, and it was Fenwick who made it possible. Fenwick was the sort of young man whose hair suggested a different kind of life than the one he was actually living, which was the life of a person who had memorized the Harlan Public Library's research holdings down to the periodical archives. He was perhaps 25 with the focused, slightly distracted manner of someone who is always thinking about 3 things simultaneously, one of which is usually where to find a specific document. When Harlow came to the reference desk and explained what he needed, the relevant sections of Kentucky auction law, the state's agricultural commerce statutes, the federal antitrust provisions concerning bid manipulation, Fenwick didn't ask why. He asked which counties the auctions had been in because the jurisdictional question mattered for which statutes applied, and he had the relevant materials on the table in 11 minutes. Harlow read for 2 afternoons. He was not a fast reader in legal documents because legal documents are not designed for fast reading, and he had learned long ago not to rush through anything that required precision. He read each section twice. He made notes on a separate piece of paper, not in the ledger, because the ledger was for facts, and these notes were for understanding. The Kentucky Revised Statutes governing auction practices describe with considerable specificity the obligations of licensed auctioneers to conduct sales in a manner that promoted genuine competitive bidding. The Agricultural Commerce Statutes extended those obligations to farm property sales conducted under estate conditions. The Federal Sherman Antitrust Act, Section 1, prohibited contracts, combinations, or conspiracies in restraint of trade, and the case law Fenwick helped him locate made explicit that bid rigging at auctions constituted exactly such a conspiracy. Then he found the term. It was in a law review article that Fenwick located in the periodical archive, a piece from a Kentucky law journal about agricultural auction fraud patterns in Appalachian counties. The term was knockout ring. The definition was precise, a conspiracy in which a group of buyers agrees not to compete against each other at a public auction. Suppressing the hammer price then divides the profit from subsequent resale among the conspirators. Harlow read the definition twice. He set the journal down. He looked at the high windows of the library's reading room, which admitted the April light in the way that old institutional buildings admit light, filtered and slightly softened, the kind of light that has no urgency to it. The definition matched what was in his ledger with the precision of a parts diagram matching the engine it was drawn from. He thanked Fenwick. He drove home. He sat in the workshop and opened the ledger to the first page and read it straight through to the last entry. And when he reached the end, he turned to the summary section he had been building since January, updating it as each new piece of information came in. He had not thought of this section as a legal brief. He had thought of it as a mechanic's diagnostic report, the presentation of evidence organized to allow another person to follow the logic from symptom to cause. It was a documented knockout ring. 9 auctions observed, 7 showing the pattern, 2 showing its absence. The absence producing fair market results, the presence producing suppression averaging 28.4% below appraised value. 3 recurring bidder numbers, one of them traceable to Darren Speck, one to an entity called Blue Ridge Property Group, whose registered agent shared an address with Speck's Redstone Land Holdings, one to a man named Clifford Baines, who appeared in the Secretary of State's records as a member of both entities. Resale data confirming that every suppressed price acquisition had been or was being liquidated at market value. The connection between Darren Speck and Colt Graver documented through the business filing cross-reference. He turned to a fresh page in the summary section. He calculated the average price suppression per auction 28.4%. He multiplied that figure by the combined appraised values of the 7 affected properties. He was not a forensic accountant. His calculation was not precise in the way that a professional examination would be precise. But the number it produced, roughly $800,000 in suppressed value across the properties he had personally documented, told him that what he was looking at was not minor. This was organized, sustained, deliberate extraction. He put his pencil down. He was almost ready. Almost was still not quite. The problem announced itself on a Tuesday evening in late May, with the ledger open on the workshop bench and the summary section complete, and the drive to Frankfurt less than 2 weeks away on his mental calendar. He had been reading back through the cross-reference documentation following the chain from bidder number to registered entity to registered agent to the connection with Colt Graver, and he stopped at a gap he had not fully acknowledged before. He had correlation, he had parallel documentation, the auction records on one side, the resale records on the other, the bidder-to-entity connections in the middle. What he did not have presented in a form that a legal investigation could act on without additional inquiry was a direct financial link between the purchasing entities and Pinnacle Rural Auction Group itself. The auctioneer's role in a knockout ring was to permit the suppression to operate to accept the ring's low hammer price without challenging it, to fail to protect the seller's interest, possibly to have arranged the thin registered bidder pool in advance. Colt Graver's operational connection to the ring through his brother-in-law was documented in the bidder registration and the entity connections, but that connection was a family relationship, which a defense attorney would argue proved nothing about Graver's knowledge or participation. Harlow sat with this gap for a long time, not panicked, not defeated. He was thinking the way he thought about difficult mechanical problems, the ones that didn't yield to the first logical diagnosis that required stepping back and approaching from a different angle. The financial records of Pinnacle Rural Auction Group were not public record. He could not access them. He was not going to try to access them through any means that wasn't legitimate because the entire value of what he had built over 14 months was that it was unimpeachable, constructed entirely from sources that anyone with the time and the inclination could verify. The moment he reached outside that boundary, the ledger became something other than what it was. But there were things adjacent to Pinnacle's private records that were public. Kentucky required licensed auctioneers to file bond documentation with the State Auction Licensing Board. Bond filings were public record. He drove back to the courthouse on a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, his usual day, because this couldn't wait until the following week. Berta Sloan was at her desk, and she looked up at him with the mild recognition of someone who has seen a familiar face arrive outside its usual schedule. He asked about auction licensing board filings. Berta Sloan told him they were accessible through the state board's public portal, which she could show him how to use on the office terminal if he didn't have access elsewhere. She showed him. He found what he needed in 40 minutes. The Pinnacle Rural Auction Group bond filing listed the company's principal officers. Colt Graver was listed as president and licensed auctioneer. Darren Speck was listed as a co-signer on the bond, not as an officer of the auction company, but as a guarantor of the company's financial obligations. That relationship was not incidental. A bond co-signer for a licensed auction company had a financial stake in that company's operations. The listing placed Speck inside the financial structure of Pinnacle in a documented public way that went beyond family connection. Harlow wrote this into the ledger. He wrote the bond filing reference number. He wrote the date of the filing and the date he had accessed it. Then he drove back home because he was done. Not almost. Done. He called his granddaughter that evening. She was the person he called when he needed to find something on the internet that required more navigation than he trusted himself to perform accurately because the stakes were too high now for a wrong number or a mistyped address. She answered on the second ring. "Grandpa?" Her voice had the warmth of a person who is always genuinely pleased by a particular phone call. "Everything okay?" Everything was fine, he told her. He needed her to find the contact information for the Kentucky Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, specifically the section that handled agricultural fraud. He needed a phone number and, if available, a name. She was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when something unexpected has arrived in a conversation. "Can I ask what this is about?" He told her he would explain later when he could explain fully. Right now, he just needed the contact information. She found it in a little over a minute. She read him the number, the address of the Frankfurt office, and the name of the division supervisor listed on the AG's website. He wrote all of it at the bottom of the ledger's last page, beneath the final auction entry. "Grandpa," she said, and the word carried something not quite concern, not quite curiosity, somewhere between them. "Are you sure you're okay?" He told her he was fine. He told her it was nothing to worry about. He thanked her, told her he loved her, said goodnight. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call with the ledger closed in front of him. The workshop light was off. The house was quiet in the way that a house occupied by one person over many years becomes quiet. A silence that has shape to it that fits the rooms. Outside the kitchen window, the late May evening was settling toward dark. He thought about Earl Caldwell, who had farmed 160 acres of Harlan County hill ground for most of his adult life, and whose land had sold for $187,000 to a man who would turn it around within a year for $54,000 more. He thought about the Pruitt family's Leslie County timber and pasture, the properties in Clay County and Perry County and Bell County farms, built by people who deserved to have their value honored by the process that disposed of them. He thought about Nora Caldwell and every heir like her who had trusted Colt Graver's practice fluency and signed the contracts and received on average 28.4% less than they should have. The difference between what they received and what fair competition would have produced was not an abstraction. It was a college fund that wasn't funded. It was a debt that wasn't cleared. It was the material representation of a loss they didn't know they had suffered. He opened the ledger one more time. He read the first entry, the Caldwell auction July, the date at the top of the first page, and he read through to the bond filing notation at the end. 14 months. He had been 20 pages into a new parts and repairs log when he started this ledger, and now it was full. Every page of it. He closed it. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket where it fit with a solidity that felt appropriate. The following morning, he called the AG's office. The receptionist transferred him to the Consumer Protection Division. He explained with the same patient precision he had brought to everything else over the preceding 14 months that he had documentation of what he believed to be an ongoing agricultural auction fraud scheme affecting multiple counties in eastern Kentucky, and that he would like to present it to the appropriate investigator. He gave his name, his county, his phone number. An investigator named Diane Corbin called him back within the hour. She asked him to describe what he had. He gave her a summary: 9 auctions, 14 months, 3 recurring bidder numbers, documented resale patterns, the connection to Pinnacle's auctioneer through the bond filing. He kept the description factual, without interpretation, the same way he would have described a mechanical diagnosis to a customer who needed to understand the problem without being confused by the diagnostic process. When he finished, there was a pause on the line. "Mr. Dees," Diane Corbin said, her voice carrying the particular quality of a professional recalibrating in real time. "When can you come to Frankfurt?" He told her he could come any morning she had available. She offered the following Tuesday. He said that was fine. He wrote the appointment in the ledger on the inside back cover because that was the only space left. The drive to Frankfurt on that September Tuesday began at 5 in the morning. The truck's headlights cut through the pre-dawn dark of Bell County. The road empty at that hour, the hills reduced to black shapes against a sky that was showing the first gray suggestion of what would eventually become morning. Harlow had filled the tank the night before. He had eaten a real breakfast before he left eggs, toast, coffee, because he had learned at some point in his life that the body performs better when it's been attended to, which is also true of engines. The ledger was on the passenger seat. He had considered putting it in a bag or a folder, some kind of protective enclosure, then decided against it. It didn't need protecting. It had survived 14 months of workshop benches, courthouse tables, truck seats, kitchen tables. It was what it was. He drove through the dark, and then through the gray, and then through the early morning light of central Kentucky, the landscape changing character as the hill country of the east gave way to the gentler rolls of the bluegrass, the pastures wider, the horizon more visible, the sky opening up in a way it didn't in Harlan County. He drove at the same pace he drove, everything steady, attentive, without urgency, in the way people mean when they use the word to excuse carelessness. He arrived in Frankfurt as the AG's office was opening. He parked in a visitor space. He picked up the ledger from the passenger seat. He went inside. The receptionist directed him to a waiting area. Diane Corbin came out to meet him. 4 minutes later, he had counted, not because he was impatient, but because counting was a habit, and she was younger than he had expected from her voice on the phone, but her eyes had the focus of someone who had spent years doing work that required looking at things carefully. She led him to her office. She gestured toward the chair across her desk. She sat down. He put the ledger on her desk. He folded his hands in his lap. She opened it to the first page. She started reading. The supervisor's name was Gerald Pugh, and he had the look of a man who had spent 25 years in government work learning to calibrate his reactions before they reached his face. He came through the door 3 minutes after Diane left, carrying a legal pad. He hadn't written anything on yet, wearing the expression of someone who had been told something unexpected on his way down the hall. He sat down beside Diane rather than behind the desk, which Harlow noted as the choice of a person who wanted to see the ledger from the same angle as the person who had compiled it. He didn't say anything for a long time either. He turned pages. He went to the summary section. He looked at the cross-reference appendix. He set the ledger down with both hands, the way you set down something with weight to it, not physical weight, but the other kind. "Mr. Dees." Gerald Pugh had a voice that belonged in a courtroom, measured without inflection, that could be used against him later. "I want to make sure I understand what I'm looking at. You attended 9 auctions over 14 months, documented all of this yourself, with no legal background, no investigative authority, no access to anything beyond public records." Harlow confirmed that was accurate. "Why didn't you come to us sooner?" The question deserved a real answer, so Harlow gave it one. "Because almost certain isn't certain. I wasn't going to bring something here until I knew what I had." Gerald Pugh looked at Diane Corbin. Something passed between them that Harlow didn't need to interpret, the kind of look that passes between professionals when something in front of them is either much more or much less than it appears, and they have both independently concluded which one it is. "We're going to need to make some calls," Gerald said. Harlow told them to take whatever time they needed. He had driven 4 hours. He wasn't in a rush. "Mr. Dees," Gerald said, setting his legal pad down, "we're going to need to open a formal inquiry. What you've brought us is—" He stopped. He chose his next words with the care of a man who knows that words in his position carry weight. "This is a serious piece of work." Harlow looked at the ledger on the desk. He thought about the Tuesday after the Caldwell auction, the workshop, the lamp, the empty first page. He thought about the 9 drives to 9 auction sites, the 4 trips to Berta Sloan's courthouse, the 2 afternoons with Fenwick and the law journals, the evenings at the kitchen table with the deed records spread out and the columns adding up. "I know what I saw," he said. "I knew how to write it down. The rest was just time." Gerald Pugh wrote a 4th line on his legal pad. Outside the window, Frankfurt went about its September morning. Somewhere 4 hours east in 4 counties that shared a particular quality of hill ground light. The land that had sold at those auctions was standing in that same light, the fields and creek bottoms and timber ridges that had changed hands at prices that were not what they should have been. The ledger was on the desk. The door was about to open further than it had opened yet. Harlow waited. The formal inquiry opened on a Thursday in late September, 8 days after Harlow sat across from Diane Corbin in Frankfurt. He was not present for the opening. He was in Bell County in his workshop doing a brake job on a neighbor's truck because the neighbor needed the truck back by Friday, and because work that needs doing doesn't pause for the larger proceedings of the world. Diane Corbin called him that afternoon to inform him that the Consumer Protection Division had initiated a formal investigation into Pinnacle Rural Auction Group under Kentucky revised statutes governing auction fraud, agricultural commerce violations, and conspiracy. She told him that the office would be issuing subpoenas for Pinnacle's internal records, bidder communications, financial documents, and correspondence. She told him that his ledger, which she referred to as the documentation you provided, with a formality that made the phrase feel larger than its words, would serve as the foundational reference for the investigative scope. She asked if he had questions. He said he didn't. She said she would be in touch as the investigation developed, that this process would take time, that he should not expect quick resolution. He told her he was familiar with work that took time. She paused at that briefly. Then she thanked him and said goodbye. He went back to the brake job. The investigation ran 8 months. Harlow tracked its progress the way he tracked most things at a distance, without agitation, gathering the information that came to him without grasping for information that didn't. Diane Corbin called every 3 to 4 weeks with updates that were measured, professional, carefully bounded by what she could share with a civilian source. The investigation had obtained Pinnacle's financial records. The investigation had interviewed registered auction participants. The investigation had issued additional subpoenas to related entities. What she didn't say directly, but what Harlow could read in the changing register of her voice over those months, slightly more deliberate, slightly more contained, the way a person's voice changes when the stakes of what they're carrying have risen, was that what the investigation was finding was larger than what the ledger had shown. He had known it might be. He had documented 14 months. The operation had been running longer. In November, 2 months into the investigation, a reporter from a Lexington paper called his house. Someone had noted the initial inquiry filing in the state's public records had connected Pinnacle Rural Auction Group to prior coverage of the rural land market, had obtained his name from a source Harlow didn't identify. The reporter was polite, prepared, asking reasonable questions about what he had observed at the auctions. Harlow told her without particular elaboration that he had attended some auctions and kept records of what he saw, that he had presented those records to the AG's office, and that the investigation was in the hands of people better equipped than he was to pursue it. She asked if he would speak in more detail. He said he preferred not to while the investigation was ongoing. She asked if there was anything he wanted people to know. He thought about it with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. "The public records are public," he said. "Anybody can look at them. That's why they're called that." She wrote that down. He could hear the pen. He didn't read the article when it ran because he didn't subscribe to the Lexington paper and didn't seek it out. His granddaughter texted him a link with 3 exclamation points, which he interpreted as positive but didn't follow up on, because what mattered about the investigation was not what got written about it, but what came out of it. The subpoenas produced what subpoenas produce when the underlying activity has been conducted by people who were careful in execution, but who did not imagine a 71-year-old retired mechanic would spend 14 months building a documented case from public records. Pinnacle Rural Auction Group's internal communications showed correspondence between Colt Graver and Darren Speck in the weeks preceding each of the pattern auctions emails, discussing registered bidder outreach conversations about managing the field references, to properties by lot number with attached notes about target acquisition prices. The forensic accountants brought in by the AG's office built the financial picture that Harlow's ledger had sketched. They had subpoena power where he'd had only public records. They had the ability to compel production of bank statements, wire transfer records, profit distributions. The picture they built was both more complete than his and entirely consistent with it, which was the confirmation that mattered most. Not that they had found things he hadn't, but that everything he had found held up precisely under professional examination. The ring had been operating for 6 years. Diane Corbin delivered this information to Harlow on a call in February, 7 months into the investigation, and even with the discipline of 14 months of methodical work behind him, even with the careful distance he had maintained from expectation, the number landed with weight. 6 years. He had documented the most recent 14 months. Before that, 5 years of the same structure, the same bidder cluster, the same suppressed prices, the same rapid resales. The affected properties numbered 23 across 4 eastern Kentucky counties. The total price suppression, the difference between what estates received at the rigged auctions and what the same properties subsequently sold for at market, was estimated by the forensic accountants at slightly over $1.4 million. $1.4 million taken from families, from estates, from heirs who had trusted the process because they had no way of knowing what Harlow, standing at the back of a July auction with 50 years of pattern recognition behind him, had been able to see. He sat with the number for a long moment on the phone. Then he asked Diane Corbin what came next. The indictments were returned on a Wednesday in May in the Harlan County Circuit Court, which had jurisdiction over the majority of the documented offenses. Colt Graver was charged on 3 counts auction fraud under Kentucky law, criminal conspiracy, and violation of the agricultural commerce statutes governing estate auction conduct. The charges were specific and substantial. Each count carried real consequence. Darren Speck was indicted on 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 count of auction fraud. Clifford Baines, the 3rd recurring member of the bidder cluster, was indicted on 2 counts of conspiracy. A 4th individual, a name that had appeared in the financial records but not in Harlow's auction observations, a man who had served as the resale broker connecting the ring's acquisitions to end buyers, was also charged. The 4th individual had 3 weeks before the indictments were returned, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a recommendation of reduced charges. His cooperation provided the last pieces of the financial structure that the forensic accountants had been assembling. The profit distribution records, the understanding between Graver and Speck about fee arrangements that masked Graver's share of the resale proceeds, the internal communications that established knowledge and intent across all 4 participants. Pinnacle Rural Auction Group surrendered its Kentucky auction license on the same day the indictments were announced. The license surrender was not contested. Harlow learned the details from Diane Corbin, who called him the morning the indictments were filed. Her voice had a different quality on this call, still controlled, still professional, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there in the months of interim calls. The quality of a person who has completed something difficult. "The indictments are formal," she said. "I wanted you to know before it became public." He thanked her. He meant it. Mr. D's. She paused in a way that had become familiar over 8 months of periodic conversation. The pause of a person choosing words that carry more than their ordinary weight. "What you built in that ledger, it was the skeleton of everything we found. Without the structural map you gave us, we would have been looking at individual transactions without the pattern that made them legible as a coordinated scheme. That matters. I want you to know that it matters." The work had mattered. He had believed it would when he was doing it, or he wouldn't have done it. But belief during the work is different from confirmation after it. He held the confirmation for a moment, the way you hold something solid after carrying something uncertain for a long time. "I appreciate you saying so," he said. The civil restitution process began in June, running parallel to the criminal proceedings. The Attorney General's office had filed a civil action against Pinnacle Rural Auction Group, and the individual defendants seeking restitution for the documented victims of the scheme, the estates whose properties had sold at suppressed prices across the 23 affected auctions. The restitution pool was constructed from the defendants' assets, which were significant but not sufficient to make every affected estate completely whole. The ring had captured real money over 6 years, but the assets available for restitution after legal costs, after the portions that had been dissipated or moved, amounted to less than the full calculated suppression. What the restitution process produced for each affected estate was a partial recovery, not the full gap between the rigged hammer price and what fair competition would have produced, a meaningful portion of it. The AG's office had been careful in how they described this outcome publicly because partial recovery is not complete justice, and they were not in the business of overstating what they had achieved. Nora Caldwell's portion of the restitution was calculated based on the documented suppression on the Caldwell farm, the gap between the $187,000 auction price and the $241,000 resale, adjusted for her transaction's share of the total suppression. The number was meaningful. It was not the full $54,000. It was enough to matter, which is the most accurate way to describe what partial justice amounts to. She received the notification letter from the AG's office on a Tuesday in late June. She read it twice. She put it down. She picked up her phone. Harlow was in the kitchen when the call came, eating lunch, a sandwich, the radio on low, the window above the sink showing the particular green of eastern Kentucky in early summer when the light is full and the hills are heavy with it. The number on his phone was a Lexington area code he didn't recognize. He answered because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize. A person might need something. Is this Harlow Dees? The voice was young female, slightly unsteady in the way a voice is unsteady when the person using it is managing more emotion than the words are supposed to carry. He said it was. This is Nora Caldwell. A pause. Earl Caldwell was my grandfather. He knew the name. He had written it more times than most names he had encountered in the preceding 14 months in the ledger, in the supporting documentation, in the summary section at the back. He knew the farm. He knew the appraisal. He knew the hammer price and the resale price and the distance between them. I know who you are, he said. Another pause longer. I got a letter today. Her voice steadied slightly, finding its footing in the factual before approaching the rest of it. From the Attorney General's office. It explained about the investigation. It explained about what happened at the auction. A breath. It said that you were the one who documented it, that you're the reason the investigation happened. Harlow didn't say anything for a moment. He looked out the window at the summer hills, the same hills he had looked at most of his life, the same quality of light he had driven home through 14 months ago after the July auction when he first understood what he had seen. I went to the auction, he said. I saw something that looked wrong. I kept track of it. For 14 months. Her voice carried something now, not quite accusation, not quite incomprehension, something closer to the specific disorientation of a person trying to absorb the scale of an effort made on their behalf by a stranger. You spent 14 months on this. You don't know me. You didn't know my grandfather, not really. He considered the question inside that statement. It was the real question, the one that mattered more than the factual ones, and it deserved the same care he had given everything else. I knew enough about your grandfather, he said. I knew his farm was good ground. I knew he'd worked it right. That's what his land showed. A man who works his land right his whole life, his family deserves to get what it's worth when the time comes. A pause. What was happening at those auctions was wrong. Somebody needed to say so, and I was the one who saw it. The silence on the line had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. You could have just walked away, Nora said. Nobody would have known. I would have known. The words came out simply without weight or decoration because they were simply true. That's enough. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had shifted in the way voices shift when a person has moved through something and come out the other side of it. Thank you, she said. I don't know what else to say. I've been sitting here trying to figure out what to say to you, and I keep coming back to that. He told her she didn't need to say anything else. He told her he was glad the investigation had found what it found, that he hoped the restitution was useful, that he was sorry about her grandfather's farm selling the way it did. He meant all of it. Is there anything I can do, she asked. For you, I mean, anything at all. He thought about it with his customary patience. The sandwich on the table, the summer hills out the window, the 14 months that had run from that July auction to this kitchen table to this phone call. No, he said. I kept the records because it needed doing. That's the whole of it. The story became public the week the indictments were announced. The Lexington paper ran a piece. The Louisville Courier-Journal picked it up. The Associated Press moved a version of it that appeared in papers across the region. People in eastern Kentucky who read the morning news that week encountered somewhere in the front section or the local pages, depending on the paper, the account of a retired mechanic from Bell County who had spent 14 months documenting an auction fraud scheme in a green-covered ledger and then driven 4 hours to Frankfurt to hand it to a state investigator. The version of the story that traveled was compressed in the way news stories compress things. The 14 months reduced to a paragraph. The methodology described in general terms, the outcome quantified in the numbers that quantified outcomes. 23 auctions, 4 counties, $1.4 million, 3 indictments, 1 cooperating witness. These were accurate numbers. They were also, like all accurate numbers, incomplete descriptions of what had actually happened. What the numbers didn't contain was the workshop in the dark, the courthouse on 4 consecutive Tuesdays, the library afternoons with Fenwick, the Knox County auction in November when the absence of the cluster confirmed everything the presence of it had suggested. The moment in late May when Harlow had sat at his kitchen table and read the ledger from the first page to the last and understood that the work was complete, that what he had built was sufficient for what it needed to do. A photographer from the Lexington paper was outside the AG's office in Frankfurt on the morning the indictments were announced, positioned near the entrance, because she had been covering the story for 3 months and knew that Harlow Dees had been invited to the office that morning to be formally notified of the charges. She was a young woman who had been in this work long enough to know that the photographs that matter are rarely the ones you plan. She had her camera ready when the doors opened because that was her job, not because she expected anything particular. What she caught was not the photograph she had positioned herself to take. Harlow came through the doors of the building into the May morning, the same flannel shirt the ledger carried under his left arm, the way you carry something you have been carrying for a long time and whose weight has become ordinary to you. He paused on the steps, not for the camera, not for anyone. Just the pause of a man emerging from an interior space into outdoor light, adjusting to the change. She pressed the shutter without thinking about it the way a photographer presses the shutter when something presents itself before analysis has a chance to interfere. What the photograph showed when she reviewed it later was a man in a flannel shirt carrying a green ledger under his arm, standing in Maylight on the steps of a government building, not smiling. He was not the kind of man who performed emotion for cameras. But there was something in his expression that she had not planned for and could not have staged the particular quality of settled completion that belongs to a person who has finished something they started, who has done what they set out to do, who has arrived at the end of a long piece of work without having cut corners in the middle of it. She ran the photograph with the story. The caption identified him by name, gave his age, described him as a retired mechanic from Bell County. The photograph did the rest of the describing. The reporter who had called his house in November was outside the building too. She had covered this story longer than the photographer and had a different set of questions now that the outcome was visible. She approached him as he came down the steps. "Mr. Dees, now that the indictments are in, do you feel like this was worth it? 14 months of your time, all that work." He looked at the ledger under his arm. He thought about the 23 auctions, the $1.4 million distributed across the states that had received 70 cents on the dollar for land that was worth a full dollar. He thought about Earl Caldwell's 160 acres going under the hammer at $187,000 and Nora's voice on the phone, the disorientation in it. "Worth it isn't the right frame," he said. "It was wrong. Somebody needed to do something about it. I had what was needed to do that, the time, the position, the records have it. So I did it. Worth it implies I was weighing the cost. I wasn't particularly." She wrote that down. "Are you proud of what you accomplished?" He considered the word. Pride was a thing he associated with performance, with outcomes that exceeded expectation, with the receipt of something beyond what was owed. What he had done was not beyond what was owed. It was exactly what was owed from a person in his position who had seen what he had seen. "I don't know about proud," he said. "I know what I saw. I knew how to write it down. That's about all there was to it." She wrote that down too. He said goodbye. He walked to his truck. He put the ledger on the passenger seat where it had ridden to Frankfurt 8 months ago. He started the engine. He pulled out of the lot into the ordinary Frankfurt morning and drove east toward home. There is a version of this story that happens far more often than Harlow's version. In that version, the Caldwell farm sells for $187,000, and the ring pockets the difference, and nobody standing at the back of that July crowd has 50 years of pattern recognition behind them. And Colt Graver drives to the next auction on the pinnacle schedule, and the month after that, and the month after that, And the families of eastern Kentucky receive 70 cents on the dollar for land their people built over generations. And they have no way of knowing why, because the mechanism that shortchanged them was designed not to be visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it in exactly the right way. That version is common. Harlow's version is not. The distance between them is not the distance between ordinary people and extraordinary ones. It is the distance between a person who walks away from something wrong because addressing it isn't required, and a person who understands that it being wrong is the requirement. Everything else, the ledger, the 14 months, the courthouse Tuesdays, the library afternoons, followed from that understanding the way consequences follow from causes. Harlow Dees is 73 years old now. He lives in the same house in Bell County he has occupied for 37 years, 12 miles from where he was born. The truck has 211,000 miles on it. He maintains it himself. It runs without complaint. He still attends farm auctions. Not as many as he did in the years before the investigation. Not the sustained attendance of a man on a mission, but the regular occasional presence of someone who has always found auctions useful for understanding the state of things. He stands at the back of the crowd. He watches. He is not looking for fraud specifically. He has not appointed himself the permanent watchman of Eastern Kentucky's agricultural auction market. What happened with the Pinnacle Ring was a particular situation that required a particular response, and he gave it, and it is done. The ongoing institutions, the AG's office, the State Auction Licensing Board, the increased scrutiny that followed the Graver case and how estate auction proceedings in the region are monitored, are better equipped than one retired mechanic to provide systematic oversight. But he watches because watching is what you do when you care about something. Because the land that changes hands at those auctions belongs to families, to the work of generations, to the accumulated meaning of a way of life that deserves honest dealing at its end. Because someone standing at the back of the crowd with the capacity to see clearly has an obligation that doesn't expire with the completion of any one task. He keeps a new ledger. It is not an evidence ledger. There is nothing in it that would interest an investigator. It contains the ordinary records of a man who finds comfort in documentation, who keeps track of auction results the way other men keep track of weather patterns or baseball scores, not because the information will be used, but because the act of recording it is itself a form of attention. Last month, at a farm sale in Bell County on a Tuesday morning, with a thin high overcast that softened the light and made the hill pastures look the way they look in old photographs, a 90-acre property, 3 generations in the same family, the kind of ground that told its own history through how it had been maintained. Harlow arrived early. He stood at the back. He photographed the bidder list out of habit, the same habit formed in the service of something necessary that had not left him. He watched the proceedings with the patient attention of a man who has been watching similar proceedings for most of his adult life. The bidding was genuine. He could feel it the way he felt a correctly functioning system, the particular quality of authentic competition, the back and forth energy of people who actually want the same thing. No cluster, no managed stillness. The crowd moved through the lot with the honest variability of real desire, and when the hammer fell, the room had the specific quality of a fair outcome. Not dramatic, not surprising, just right in the way that things are, right when they are operating the way they are supposed to operate. The hammer price was $248,000. The county appraisal had been $251,000. Harlow drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open. He wrote the date, the location, the property description, the appraised value, the hammer price. He looked at the numbers for a moment. He wrote within range, fair result. He closed the ledger. He set it on the kitchen counter. He put the kettle on. Outside the window, the evening hills of Bell County held the last of the daylight, the way they always did. The hilltops bright while the hollows went blue beneath them. The land unchanged and indifferent to everything that had happened in the years since a retired mechanic had first opened a green ledger and written a date at the top of the first page. The kettle sounded. He made his coffee. He stood at the window for a while with the cup in his hands. What you see and what you can prove are the same thing only if you were paying attention and you wrote it down. He had been paying attention. He had written it down. The new page in the ledger was blank, as all new pages are waiting for the next date, the next auction, the next record kept by a man who has always believed that what you witness matters more when someone takes the time to write it down.